By the time Naashá Begay was 38, the winter of her life felt less like a season and more like a ledger finally closing. The ledger had names and numbers and the heavy, ugly print of promises riven away. She had kept her family's medicine and songs, tended the sick on the edge of the reservation where the plain met the relentless whitewash of the frontier town called Calico Bend, and bartered jars of poultices in trade for grains and paper. She had buried her husband in a place she made holy, an outcrop of sandstone where the wind seemed to remember his laugh. She had not expected justice to follow. They had come with a warrant that smelled like paper and oil, written with the same crooked hand that had bought up the land around the bend. Captain Thorne of the cavalry, his mouth always dry like the barrels of the guns he polished, had read the warrant in the town square and called it lawful. Nathaniel Crane, who owned half the county and loaned out the rest for a price, stood behind him and gave no face to the women he drove from their homesteads. The charge against Naashá was simple in law and cruel in spirit, harboring an outlaw. The proof was a house left in ashes and a name scribbled on a receipt, one signature on a deed, one signature in the ledger, and men who could buy a judge could call you guilty. She had watched the men who claimed to protect law stand and count noses, while the women packed what they could into sacks and loaded their children onto wagons. She had watched the deputy take her trading ledger. Ledgers were a kind of living map of her life, and the men in stiff hats laugh at the ink. They took more than paper. They took the very idea that she could have savings, that she could be trusted with land, that she could be a widow and not a thing to be moved. When the sheriff who once sat on her porch for chicken stew and asked after her mother's cough pointed his hand and said, "Pack up, Begay," the shame felt like a fist. There were nights she lay awake and counted the holes in the roof of her little hogan where the fire had warmed them in the winter. There were days she walked the high ridge and looked down at the thin thread of trail that connected her world to the town. She was a medicine woman. People leaned against her knowledge of roots and bone setting, of songs that steadied a frightened birth and prayers that eased fevered sweat. She could untangle what ailed a man without seeing his papers, but the law was not something she could treat with herbs. The law had teeth and a stomach for land. Her decision to hide and to fight was not born of bravado. It came from the small, steady anger that riggers into resolve, from the faces of 3 widows who came to her the week before, hands raw from sewing and eyes hollow from exhaustion, asking if there was a way to keep the one field that fed their families. It came from the daughter of a man who'd asked Naashá to gather her in when the fever came. The girl now had to walk more miles for bread. It came from the ledger she could not bear to watch change hands. Justice whispered like wind in the juniper. If not me, who? If not now, when? The night he stumbled into the wash was the night the sky had been empty of stars, a flat bruise over the mesas. She found him where the gullies met, half buried in dust and the bitter smell of iron, breathing with the ragged patience of someone who'd learned to be ugly to live. The man's coat was shot through with grime and dried blood. His right shoulder hung in an angle that shouldn't hold weight. At first, she thought him one of the migrants the town had spat out, another man looking for work in a place that gave nothing. He hummed a tune under his breath like apology. "You're hurt," she said, the language of the soldiers and the language of the Dene braided in her mouth. He flinched at the sound. Not many spoke Dene in the wash outside Calico Bend. "Guess I'm dead then," he said, voice like gravel, but his eyes, amber and honest and tired, looked at her with a kind of liberty she hadn't seen in a while. There was no immediate recognition in his face of guilt, only the sharp knowledge that he had been shot and needed help. For a moment, she allowed herself the slow measurement a judge might use. He could be the outlaw. He could be the land stealer's hire. He could be the kind of man who would drag her down by association. She had reasons to be careful. She had reasons to be cautious. But the woman inside her who tied strings and sewed bandages and knew the curl of a child's fever decided. This man breathed beneath her hand. His breath was ragged and human. He had a name and a voice that was an apology. Cole. It was nothing. It was everything. Shelter him, she thought. It was a decision threaded through the need to do what was right by the human in front of her, and the tactical stubbornness of someone who had nothing left to lose. She would not be a bystander to suffering. She would not let the laws of others define the integrity of her heart. She had learned at 38 that the world could be cruel and eloquent at once, that sometimes the right thing carried risk. She would accept his help only where it served her aims. A partnership, then, on terms she set. She would not be a saint. She would be a woman with choices. She folded a scrap of blanket over Cole's arm and felt how the fracture had set the muscle into a lock. She hummed a low song between the syllables of prayer and poultice, the kind that mended bone and steadied breath. In the hollow of her palm, she tasted iron and saw the future like a thread, crude, thin, and unspooled. He would owe her, and she would demand currency in deeds, not promises. The outlaw, if he truly was one, would be useful. The man in her tent could be an ally if he offered more than muscle, information, reach, the kind of tough kindness that does not demand to be in command. Inside the small shelter she built back at the Hogan, the flames ate at the cold, and the smell of sage burned. Her hands moved with the assurance of a woman who had tied 1,000 knots in her life. She swaddled a stranger and, for reasons she could not yet name, began to plan. Not for his rescue, for her reclamation. The first days together were a set of small negotiations. Naashá moved with the natural economy of someone who knew scarcity. She rationed water, patched the fired roof, bartered flour and beans from the sacks she'd hidden beneath floorboards. Cole, he insisted on his name being said without other titles, as if the sound of it anchored him, saw the ledger buried behind a loose stone and did not speak. He had the kind of manners that confessed to a rough upbringing, a quick hand, a mouth that smelled of whiskey, and an ability to trust very few voices. "What's your end of this?" Naashá asked once, while dressing his shoulder with a poultice of yarrow and pine sap to draw infection. Her fingers knew how much pressure was too much and where to set the bone. He watched her hands like they belonged to a priestess. "Survival," Cole said, "and maybe to not die in a ditch." "That's not an answer," she said, but the corner of her mouth softened. She liked the bluntness. It was honest bartering even when cloaked in humor. He stayed because she made a place he could not refuse. The Hogan was small and smelled of coffee, and the stove was the kind that made tea that felt like a hand on the back of your neck. When he was well enough to sit up, Naashá placed his rifle across the corner of the room, far enough to be removed if he woke from fever and for the eyes of soldiers. Trust, like medicine, had stages. Their escape from the cavalry and the gang that pressed at Calico Bend was less about daring runs and more about cunning patience. The cavalry made their rounds and shouted questions into the wind. Naashá taught Cole how to read the land like a book. "A soldier follows a path for a path's sake," she told him as they watched hoofprints in the dust. "But a man who lives by the land sees the secret paths." She showed him dry washes that hid scent, little hollows where the wind curled away so that you could move without leaving a trace, and the slow, steady heat breaths of night that could swallow movement. In turn, Cole gave her other sorts of instruction: how to smooth a saddle for less creak, and how to eavesdrop without appearing rude. He taught her tricks acquired from a life with crooked corners: how to cut the thread of a rope so no one would hear, how to read a man's hands to find what he feared, and the small lies that keep you alive. She found his talents useful without romanticizing them. He was not a teacher of virtue. He was a man who had learned to survive, and survival could be used for good if held with a purpose. Their first joint success came in the form of a misguided posse and a burned cartel of men sent by Crane. Calico Bend bristled with men in high hats and cowed cattle. The posse tramped the old trading road thinking they'd find fugitives on the far ridge. Naashá led Cole and 2 women, Maria Cortez, who kept a small ranch of goats on the southern bend, and Aunt Lona, an elder who could read horses like scriptures, on a route that bended and wove around the cavalry's direct line. They used the sage smoke to blind scent. When the 2 groups passed within earshot of each other, Cole and Maria dislodged a makeshift barrier of brush to send the cavalry away in an opposite direction, and Aunt Lona sang a low calling that distracted the dogs. It was not a cinematic escape. There were no last-second leaps off cliffs, just cold feet and good timing and dexterity. They crawled behind a tangle of tamarisk, while 2 men in uniform passed by, cursing about half-breeds and hired guns. Naashá's heart pounded against the ribs of her chest like a small hunted bird, but she kept her breaths long and even. She felt the ground under her like a familiar hand. Later, by a low fire, Cole offered her food and then something else: information. "You're not the first they targeted," he said, passing her a strip of cured meat. "Crane's been buying up deeds, but he's also been hiring men to tie up anyone who could protest." He named names: men who had once been called sheriffs, merchants, men who wore the county's emblem like a belligerent badge. The list was long, and every name landed like a stone in the well of her mind. She did not forgive easily. Forgiveness had to be earned with honesty and repair, not proffered for the convenience of peace. She considered the ledger again, the lines of ink that spelled out who owed whom, and the women who had gathered eggs at dawn, mouths tight with worry. The alliance formed between her and Cole was not marital at first. It was transactional and then threaded into something more complex. Respect built like the steady laying of stone. He had seen things and lived like a man who had few illusions. In return, she offered him a steady place, warm meals, a chance to sleep without a foot on his chest, and a place to be less dangerous. She taught him how to hold a child. He taught her how to listen for the rhythm of a lie in the voice of men who profited from suffering. In those first days of alliance, she was not rescued. She was strategic. She chose to accept a wounded stranger because she was practical and because she understood that sometimes to move forward, you needed hands you could trust. She made the rules. He followed them, not out of fear but out of a dawning respect. Each small victory, an avoided patrol, an intercepted letter, was proof that their partnership could be more than necessity. It could be a union of talents, of wills, of purpose. The canyon they claimed for a while as sanctuary had a spring that sang at dawn and a small alcove the wind could not reach. Naashá called it a safe circle, a place the elders said hid more than bodies. It hid truths. There, she began to rebuild, not because she hoped to return to what was before. She knew better than most that time did not reverse, but because she could fashion a future from the fragments. At 38, she had the wear of years on her hands, the fine lines around her eyes earned from laughter and grief, and a knowledge that every small kindness was a stitch in a wider tapestry. She set up a small clinic under the lee of the alcove, draping curtains to shield patients from the wind. Her medicine chest, once nearly emptied by the raid, was replenished by trade and scavenged vomits of herbs. She taught Cole the names of plants she would not sing aloud, the practical labels of roots and barks, and refused to let him cross certain lines of ritual. "There are songs you cannot carry," she told him. "There are names that are not for barter." He listened with the humility of a man beginning to understand the edges of respect. From the women who arrived seeking care, Naashá learned other forms of power. Maria brought goats, and a score of women, widows, mothers, a young teacher named Ruth, with the sharp eyes of someone who had read more than the Bible, arrived with goods to exchange and ears to hear. The small clinic became a hub, fever mended, bones set, harvests planned. Naashá's competence in healing gave her an authority that was not legal, but was, in the intimate economy of survival, absolute. People who were once customers became collaborators. The women learned that together they could pool resources, shared seeds, covert watches, a rotation of nights on watch. Cole surprised her more than once. He learned to move quietly, to sit without offering advice, to watch children's faces for small signs of disease. He learned the rituals of tending bathwater and how to mix a poultice. Naashá noticed the change with a quiet appraisal. He was not transformed by magic, but by the steady, mundane work of care. He could hold space for grief without trying to fix it. He could, on occasion, be a mirror to her anger and not a foil for it. As she healed others, she found her own healing. The first night she slept through the whole dark without waking at every creak of the hogun. She felt her shoulders relax in a way she had forgotten was possible. In the safe circle, she learned to make decisions without that old, crushing back and forth about whether she deserved to take anything for herself. Her appearance, once the ragged shawls and hair pinned in hurried knots, softened into functional strength. She braided her hair back when she planned to ride. She wore a leather apron when stitching dressings. Her clothes became a map of competency. Scuffed boots, a patched sleeve that bore the stain of 1,000 poultices, and a scarf that had once been her husband's, knotted now at her throat like a talisman. Naashá began to deliberate on the future. She had always been a woman of practical dreams. An enclosed garden, a place where winter would not shrink her food stores, or a ledger that was more than balancing names. She longed for property that bore her name on paper, and a clinic open to anyone who needed it. Each seed of vision was fed by the wilder thing embedded like a root: justice. She wanted to bring down crabtree men and crooked judges, not to see them suffer for the thrill, but to rescue her people from the cycle of dispossession. In this quiet growth, the first threads of real partnership tightened. It was not simply attraction. The attraction hummed beneath their wilder conversations about the future, but the bedrock was respect. Cole watched her in the washing light of morning stitching a bandage and felt something like reverence. He had been in a life of profit and quick measures. Here he saw cost in human terms and the labor to marry the ledger to the truth. One night, by the lip of the spring, they shared a silence that tasted like trust. "You could go into town," he said, "and cause a stir. We could make it look like men did what we wanted." Naashá's laugh was small. "I do not want men making noise for my plans. I want women with clean hands." Her voice folded the phrase like bread. "You are not here to fix me, Cole. You are here to be useful. That is different." He nodded, because he understood that the best kind of help honored the other's agency. "Don't mistake me for useless," he said. And with that grin that showed more kindness than vanity, he added, "But I will follow your lead." She believed him. The trust, practical, earned, and sometimes fragile, became the foundation of an alliance that would not be shaped by who rescued whom, but by how they shared the road ahead. Naashá's discovery of strength was not a sudden flame. It was slow-cooked, a simmering of competence and community. The woman who had been shoved aside by law and ledger was learning that she had allies in more than the form of men with guns. She had allies in women with hands that could sew, strike, and heal. The discovery felt less like rebirth and more like remembering how to stand when the world pressed hard. Cole's past arrived in fragments, like the way a wound looks when you first peel back the cloth. He would tell a story here, an anecdote there, moments that explained how a man with his knuckles could end up with a ledger of bad debts. He had once worked as muscle for a man who styled himself a banker, and as a courier for men who hid behind licenses. He had learnt to open safes with the same hand that could pick a child's fever. He had run with men who called themselves outlaws, because they lived by no law but their own, and had been beaten by men who claimed to be civil. But the revelation that mattered to Naashá was not a confession of guilt. It was the way his skills could be repurposed. Locks are the same whether you take what's inside or rescue what's rightfully kept, Cole said one morning, showing Naashá how to hide a bundle of deeds within a false bottom of a chest. He had a locksmith's patience and a surveyor's eye. He knew how men thought because he had spent years being that man. In those stories of his youth lay tools, knowledge she could use. She began to map his experiences onto their aim. If men like Crane kept deeds locked away in safe boxes and bank vaults, then those vaults were vulnerable to the patient hand. If the sheriff had men who took bribes, there were marks on his ledger only a keen eye could find. Cole became her instrument of subterfuge rather than of violence. A man who could open doors silently, read guard schedules, and slip ink-proof letters where eyes that mattered would see them. He learned to tether his moral compass to Naashá's directives. He used his old life not for revenge, but as a scalpel to remove the rot. This repurposing of his past was not seamless. It demanded a code from Cole that was as new as any oath. He refused to kill except in defense. He would not take delight in the kind of cruelty he had been paid to deliver. Naashá watched him wrestle with these choices and never once led him by the hand to make the right decision. He had to learn to want to be better, because he did not want to be the kind of man she despised. The court of their days was harsh but educating. Their plan evolved with care. The aim was to expose Crane's chain of illegal purchases and to embarrass the cavalry into turning their eyes. Cole suggested a map, rail hubs where men changed hands, ledger rooms with poor locks, the ridges where dispatches traveled. Naashá countered with subtlety. Coax testimonies from the women of Calico Bend and the reservation. Create a record of the thefts that even a man with a thin conscience would struggle to explain away. They set about stitching the two strategies together. Cole would go into town with the job of a harmless trader to catalog the safe holdings. He would use his past contacts to charm a clerk or lift a key. Naashá would remain at the safe circle, tending the sick, and drawing out the courage of the women who feared to speak. Her presence was not just symbolic. She chronicled every story in a ledger of her own, a secret record. When the land was taken, she whispered to Maria while they rolled bandages. Someone's hand wrote those lines. Hands can be forced to write other things. In those days, their attraction matured into something more complicated than companionship. It was a mutual awe at the other's guts. Cole admired Naashá's unwillingness to be diminished and the way she commanded respect without raising her voice. She admired his capacity to change the tools of his past into instruments of redress. She never softened into the idea that he completed her. If anything, he mirrored her courage and added leverage. They were equals by intention. Partnership was not a rewriting of each other's weakness into some tidy synergy, but a recognition of their separate strengths and a commitment to use them together. When Cole returned from his forays into town with a small brass key, sweat dried along his jaw, he handed it to Naashá like a gift. He did not expect more than acceptance. She took it, turning it in her fingers as she would an herb, feeling the weight of something that could undo bindings. "We will need to know where this opens," she said, "but we will not use violence as a first language." His past informed the way they moved through the county. It provided a dialect of survival that Naashá shaped into a lexicon of justice. The man who had once feared nothing saved became a man who feared harming the innocent. In the process, he shed one kind of identity and adopted a different one, not because Naashá taught him to, but because he chose to stand beside her. The transformation of his past into a force for her cause was not the erasure of his sins. It was the reorientation of his talents under her moral gravity. Naashá's history with Crane and the cavalry was not a tale of personal vendetta. It was a record of systematic dispossession. Nathaniel Crane had not only bought land, he had leveraged false claims, coerced signatures from frightened tenants, and bribed clerks to alter ledgers. Captain Thorne had found it convenient to bless these transactions with the coercive power of soldiers who were often unpaid and thus hungry for favor. Naashá had come to see the pattern. When a man valued profit over life, he would arrange the law to be an instrument of his greed. The deepest bruise she carried was the memory of her brother, Dine, who had been hauled off for a petty infraction and not returned. The rumor was that he had been taken north to work for a mine and had likely died there feeding a pit that would not be named. She had not had the power to stop it. The ledger had ripped out his name like a thread. She bore that absence like a physical weight. It was a private grief that would not let her be contained. It became the axis around which her determination spun. She wanted more than retaliation. What she wanted was to break the system that allowed a man like Crane to consolidate land and power by exploiting the legal apparatus and by turning men of the law into tools. It was one thing to fight outlaws in the dirt. It was another to uproot something that sat in courtrooms and in bank ledgers. She desired a justice that would return property and sovereignty to those from whom it was stolen and ensure no one could rewrite the names on their houses. Her plan waxed with audacious patience. First, they would need documentation, deeds, receipts, signatures that could be shown to a judge who had not been bought outright. Cole's key opened a clerk's drawer where Crane kept copies of transactions. It took 3 trips, a careful decoy, and a measure of nerve to slip inside the clerk's office at noon when men played cards at the saloon. Cole watched the windows and engaged the clerk in a con drawn like a map. He pocketed a sheaf of papers and returned with a small, frightened smile. The papers were imperfect. Some were marked, some were forgeries, but in the smudge of ink and the wrong dates lay proof of pattern. Naashá read each line with the same care she used when diagnosing an illness. "See here," she said to Maria and Ruth, pointing to a signature that had been traced by a clumsy hand. "Look at this mark where the pen pressed twice. It's not a natural stroke." Ruth, with her schoolteacher's eye, noticed the mismatched paper and the missing wax seals. They began compiling an array of evidence: receipts, testimony, and signatures. They wrote statements and had them sworn by the women in their community, who signed only when Naashá placed a hand over their own in the old way, doing a quiet blessing that was not one she would describe in public. The women's signatures, often ignored, became the thing that would knock a man off his pedestal. Naashá wanted the law to work for those it had been written to protect, rather than against the poor. She knew this would be dangerous. Crane had friends in high places and men who would not hesitate to buy silence. The cavalry would not be easy to maneuver, but every time a widow came with a child starving, or a tenant still owed last season's rent, her resolve hardened. She wrote into the ledger of their plan an ultimatum: they would pursue the legal route first. If the law refused to respond, they would expose Crane to the public, letters to printers in nearby towns, to traveling judges, and to the men who kept ledgers of their own. It was her righteous anger that guided the plan, but it was temperate. Justice, in her view, required proof and restraint and strategy. She understood the cost. Women and children could be threatened. She arranged watches, hid grain, and had sheep moved to covert pastures. She taught the women how to hide the ledgers and how to recognize the man who might come to threaten them. No one would do this for her. She would lead. At night, when the moon was a sliver, she would sit and trace the letters of her brother's name on a scrap of paper and feel the blood of loss. Then she would fold her chin to her chest and plan the next move. Her will hardened not into vengeance, but into resolve to erect systems that could not be bought with coin or cowhide. When Cole returned from a scouting mission, he had found a ledger remnant, Crane's signature, and a note about payments to the cavalry housed in a private account. The sight of that paper made Naashá's heart clench. It was evidence of the rot. They could present it, she knew, in a public forum and watch as a chain of men found themselves with no place to hide. But she also knew power would not loosen without a fight. "I will not run," she told the women in the alcove, her voice steady. "We will stand and make them account for what they have done. I will not let our names be erased." They believed her because she had earned belief. She was not some avenging angel. She was a woman who had been wronged and refused to let that wrong be the end of the story. Her fight would be deliberate, measured, and led by the force of her own choice. Cole would stand beside her, not as a savior, but as a strategist, who would use his flashlight of past sins to reveal the corruption in the light of day. They had both sworn to something greater, to make the law serve its people again. The meeting under the cottonwood was less like a war council than a conversation between minds that respected each other's borders. Naashá spread the documents they'd managed to unearth across a blanket, the paper fluttering like small birds. Maria and Ruth sat beside her, and Cole leaned against the trunk with a rifle across his knees, as if it were now part of the planning rather than the primal protection. They mapped the attack on Crane's holding, with the kind of detail that belonged to women who knew the cost of small errors. "We need more testimony," Ruth said, tapping a page. "And not just hearsay. We need signatures and dates and names." Naashá nodded. "And we will collect them. Aunt Lona will go to the boarding house and gather statements. Maria will cross the river and speak to the women on the farms. I will go to the mission and speak with the teachers' wives." Her voice carried the matter-of-factness of a woman who had always made lists and kept them. Cole's role was to create openings. He used his knowledge carefully, slipping into the county seat as an unassuming trader, watching the clerk who kept the vault, learning the cattleman's gossip. "There's a register for account payments that Crane doesn't want public," he reported. "He pays men off through a private ledger that moves cash under the table." He offered routes for getting the ledger itself, but Naashá shook her head at any temptation to steal out of revenge. "The ledger must be exposed with evidence and testimony to stitch the legal case." "Then we set the stage," Naashá said. "We place witnesses. We bring copies to a judge who will not take a side, or to a traveling magistrate. We show them the pattern and the proof. We make their own men unable to ignore the truth." Their planning was so meticulous because they were equal in contributions. Cole suggested pathways and diversions. Naashá shaped those into moral frameworks. She taught him patience the way a midwife taught breathing in the push before birth. "You have to listen, Cole," she said once, as they practiced how to approach a frightened woman who was too scared to sign a statement. "Listen to fear. Listen to where the body holds the story. Do not try to fill the silence with your answers." He listened, and in that listening, he learned to ask questions without leading. He learned how a woman's eyes could betray her fear even as her mouth said a braver thing. He learned that the softest voice could hold the loudest truth. When Maria finally came back with the signatures of half a dozen women who had been forced to sell their rights to land, they celebrated in quiet, not in triumph, but in hard-won solidarity. For the first time, Cole learned to be taught by a woman. "You have a way of seeing rust in the heart of a ledger," he said. "I never thought to look so close." Naashá smiled without condescension. "You looked at men and fear. I looked at paper and promise. We both see different kinds of truth." Her hands folded on her knees, the sun outlining the lines of her face like a map. "We will be patient, clever, and ruthless where necessary, but cruelty is not our tool." Their intimacy deepened alongside their strategic planning. Nights were shared under the stars when they spoke of their pasts without varnish. Cole would tell of the men he had worked for, and the shame that had lodged in his jaw. Naashá told him of the brother she never found, of the ledger that had swallowed whole lives. In that telling, they healed each other by being witnesses rather than saviors. The transformation in their bond brought them closer to a romantic possibility that neither rushed nor begged. She taught him Navajo tracking, how to read the way the chicken stilled its head or where a coyote had left a scent. "It's not magic," she explained as they crept near a field. "It's attention." Cole, who had once measured his worth in the number of jobs done and debts collected, found that he liked being useful in ways that birthed care. She taught him the difference between a wound that could be sewn and a wound that needed to be listened to. He learned how to hold both. When the time came to present the evidence, it was their plan executed as equals. Cole and Naashá sat together before a magistrate with the women's testimonies carefully folded and placed in the officer's hands. They did not boast. They let the facts and the women's voices do the speaking. It was a fragile victory. The magistrate was moved and an inquiry was ordered, but Crane had men, money, and influence. For every small triumph, there was pushback. But in that shift, two people working in tandem, embodying respect and mutual growth, Naashá felt the taste of something she had not tasted in years. The possibility that she could steer her own life with the help of someone who loved her as an equal, not as a prize. The decision pressed on her like winter's weight, to press forward and risk more for the sake of public vindication, or to hold back and preserve the fragile web they had spun. Naashá sat alone on the ridge above the safe circle, watching the sun bruise the horizon. The ledger swam in her mind, the names heavy. If she went to the magistrate and pushed too hard, Crane's men might storm the homes of those who had signed statements. The cavalry could be turned into a blade against her people. If she didn't push, the theft would stand, and the women whose signatures trembled on paper would be left with words that would mean nothing. The choice was hers, and hers alone. Cole knew this. He had watched her work and had never once made the decision for her. That had been their covenant. She led, and he followed with a willing heart. Now he held the small sheaf of evidence in the cloak of his coat and waited for her to say what they would do. He had learned to trust the woman who had been called every name that greed could invent, and had still stood. "I could push hard," Cole said, breaking the silence like a throw of gravel. "I could go in and make noise. I could break into Crane's office and take documents." Naashá's eyes didn't leave the eastern sky. She inhaled slow, feeling the air that tasted of pine and distant rain. Noise gets us headlines, but headlines can be bought and traded. She tapped the thin ledger of their own, the list of names and statements. Justice needs more than fury. It needs witnesses, papers, and judges who don't sleep at the table with the men they are supposed to be overseeing. He watched her with an expression of genuine admiration. "Then we stack the deck," he said. "We gather every signature, every receipt, then we present. If they won't listen, we show the proof to other towns. We make it impossible to ignore." She imagined a life away from this tension, her own clinic in the Bend, a ledger that bore her name, fields that fed her patients, and the children who were the future of the land. She pictured a homestead where she could hang quilts and not have them grabbed by men who wore suits and spat polite lies. She imagined Cole standing at her side, not as a savior, but as a partner who would wake up at dawn and help fix a fence or hold an infant with the stern patience of someone who had learned kindness. But then came the harder thought. Did she want to be defined by the fight? She was weary of being the one in the crosshairs. She wanted to build. She wanted the gentle domestic tasks, the naming of seedlings, the arranging of jars, that the world had assumed she was unfit for. At 38, she felt the tug of a new kind of life that was neither cave nor battlefield, but a place where agency meant choosing which winter to weather. Whatever we choose, she said finally, looking at Cole, we choose it together. But understand this, if justice requires us to act where words fail, we will act. I will not let fear decide for us. He nodded. And if the cost is my life, I will offer it. His words were fierce, but she saw no dramatic necessity to allow him to throw himself away. I will not let you make that choice. There was tenderness in the way he respected the agency of her decision. He would fight for her goals, but not dictate them. For the first time in memory, Naashá felt that the shape of the future could include a man who knew when to hold and when to step back. She saw the possibility of a life where the last word belonged to her. They spent a night imagining a peaceful future. Not the naive dream of perfection, but a shared life that balanced skill and care. They walked between the starlight and their plans, and Cole offered details about a small house they could have, a clinic that took in children and elders, a ledger that carried their names in honest ink. She sketched aloud the kinds of small rules they would have. No man should decide the other's fate without hearing their voice. Property would be in both their names. Business decisions would be debated and not dictated. He added the small, tender things, an afternoon on the porch, a season of planting, without insisting the romance be the center. It became real because she chose it. The calm lasted a day. In the very hour they imagined the life, a rider cut across the plains, red dust flying, bearing news that Crane had increased the number of men at his disposal, and that Captain Thorne was asking pointed questions about the subversive activity of the women in Calico Bend. The threats were gathering like storm clouds. The safety they had cobbled together was fragile. The moment of choice was over. The consequence of their decision would come sooner than Naashá had hoped. And yet, for all the peril, she felt steadier. She had chosen. She had shaped a life not handed to her by men in high chairs, but formed at the edge of her own voice. When enemies conspire, they seldom wear identical masks. Crane and Captain Thorne were a duet of convenience, a private interest partnered with public force. The men who once smoothed papers with oil now organized raids at dusk and left notices on doors threatening eviction for the women who had testified. They moved like a pack closing in, picking the weak paths and relying on the fear that made the most vulnerable compliant. On their side, they had money, a network of men who owed favors, and a sheriff who kept his gaze low. Naashá met the escalation with a strategy that was as much about protecting lives as it was about exposing the rot. She moved supplies, rotating food to safe houses, and teaching women how to hide legal documents in the seams of quilts. She used the spring not only as a clinic, but as a storehouse of evidence and a waypoint for messages to travel beyond the county. The women learned to read the movements of soldiers and to plan their kitchen fires so they could see the outline of a horse at dawn. It was domestic cunning performed under pressure, and it worked wonders. Cole used his old contacts to intercept messages. He tracked the movements of hired men who whispered that they would clear out the place Naashá had made her base. Once, he narrowly avoided a man with a lacquered badge who had recognized him from old days. The cavalry's leverage stemmed not only from muscle but from the implied legitimacy of a uniform. Naashá understood that symbolism mattered as much as force. She compiled a list of abuses, payments branded in hidden ledgers, forced deals, and the names of men who had taken money and did not care what happened to others. But threats came from unexpected corners. One of the townswomen who had signed a statement against Crane suddenly stopped attending their meetings. She made excuses about work and sickness. Naashá shadowed her and found a letter burned in a stove, an anonymous advice to keep silent, folded with a coin. It was the same tactic Crane used to buy silence, small cruelties and large intimidations. Naashá's heart froze at the thought that their carefully stitched network could unravel on the smallest thread. They fortified. Aunt Lona trained the women in the basic defense of the homestead, teaching them how to handle a rifle and the ethics of killing only in defense. Maria and Ruth coordinated watch schedules. Naashá taught them how to use their hands to make barriers and to barricade doors with a grace that carried no cruelty. Women who once feared the sound of a boot at the porch now steeled their gaze and practiced the careful breathing of someone preparing for a winter storm. Meanwhile, Crane moved to escalate his own campaign. He hired men with names like Black Jack Harlow, cutthroats who took pride in leaving no loose ends. By the time Harlow's gang rode into town with a swagger and a ravenous appetite for violence, the women were ready. They had buried the ledgers in hollow posts, and they had moved children to Aunt Lona's state, an arrangement with the missionary who accepted them as work students and sheltered them during the day. Harlow's men sacked a farm on the outskirts, stealing grain and burning a fence. The town watched and murmured. Some cheered, thinking it was a spectacle. Naashá kept her face like a calm flame. She knew she could not prevent every injustice, but she could shape the response. Cole and a handful of men, mostly those who had refused Crane's bribes, worked in tandem with the women to shadow the thugs. They were careful not to goad Crane into violent retribution. The plan was to present the evidence and let the law, biased and slow, be forced to answer. Yet Crane's men were cunning. They set an ambush at the weir where Naashá would often meet a rider carrying petitions. Their aim was to catch the papers as they crossed over. The night before, a messenger broke his ankle near the spring, his breath short with fever. Naashá treated him and learned, with a cold realization, that Crane had placed a price on certain heads. The web tightened. She faced this tightening with the fury of someone who had no more to lose and everything to gain. She called a meeting under the cottonwood, and the women came, a ring of faces lit by oil lamps. They wore aprons and shawls that smelled of bread. They were not soldiers. They were mothers and seamstresses and teachers. They spoke of the children who had been frightened awake by gunfire, and of the men who had been hunched in canes who could not pay their rent. Naashá told them bluntly, "We are not helpless. We have knowledge. We have ink. We have witnesses. We will not back down." Aunt Lona tapped her cane. "If they come to kill us," she said, "we will make them account for their names when people ask." The courage was simple and fierce. Naasha's strategic mind turned each threat into a possibility. Harlow's men would come expecting women to cower. Instead, some were met by shudders of moving quilt frames and by women who had practiced the steady aim of a rifle. Others found themselves confronted by a place where the law's own papers had been carefully smuggled to neighboring counties. Each threat that Crane sent only strengthened the women's resolve and the clarity of Naasha's aim: expose corruption, protect the vulnerable, and win the justice that would secure their names. When Captain Thorne ordered a raid on a safe house, they were ready. The mounted soldiers came with shouts and iron-wrought confidence, but they found not just candles and quilts, but a network that had relocated children and hidden property. The soldiers could take a roof, but they could not unmake the evidence that had already crossed the county like a secret language. The forces conspired, but Naashá, with her women and with Cole at her side, conspired better. The night that felt like it would break everything began with a small betrayal. A whisper in the tavern, a woman who returned with a forced smile and folded hands. The men who served Crane bribed a clerk in the magistrate's office to confiscate a trunk they suspected contained testimony. They didn't find the ledger. Naasha's women were careful. Instead, they found Aunt Lona's trunk with personal papers and a letter that implicated a woman named Ruth in seditious behavior. The letter contained a slip of assertion forged and signed by a trembling clerk who had sold his conscience for coin. The law moved quicker than Naashá anticipated. The sheriff, who had been bought with 2 favors and a brand new horse, came bearing a writ that charged several women with seditious assembly and obstruction of legal governance. They took Ruth in the early gray while the town was still waking and left the women with the bruises of fear. The sight of Ruth, whom Naashá had watched teach children to read, shackled in the back of a wagon, was like a blade to Naasha's ribs. "Why?" Aunt Lona demanded as they watched the wagon vanish. Her voice trembled not with fear, but with a fury that had roots. "Why take her?" "They made an example," said Maria, her hands fisted. "They want to scare us." Naashá felt the world tilt. They had expected threats and intimidation. They had not expected the legal system itself to be weaponized so brazenly. In the magistrate's hall, they found a man asleep with his chin on the desk, but the clerk who'd forged the paper met Naasha's gaze with a look that pleaded for mercy. He had sold his conscience for coin. It was the most ordinary betrayal she had ever seen, the failing of a man who had thought greed could comfort his hands. The raid escalated. Crane's men ransacked the alcove by the spring, burning what they couldn't carry. They seized livestock and carried away quilts. They found Cole's bellows and a few of his tools and tossed them like child's play. Then they took a step they had not expected. They dragged Cole out, battered from previous battles, hurling accusations and old resentments like spits. Naashá ran to the yard in a fury that felt physical. Cole stood, blood streaking his cheek, bound at the wrists. Harlow's men grinned like wolves. The soldiers lined themselves in perfect, lawful lines. "You will go quietly," one of them said, the sheriff's voice sweet as a sugar jar. "No one wants blood." Naashá closed the distance, her voice a single, clean knife. "Release him," she said. "You have taken what you think will frighten us, but you cannot take our names. You cannot take the truth." They laughed. The sheriff tapped a boot. "The law doesn't care for song." The law, she thought, had never been a friend to the poor. She had always known that. But the sight of Cole, this man who had learned to change his tools into instruments for justice, bound, his chest caving with the weight of a column of men, detonated something in her. She felt the old hunger to protect. For a moment, the woman who had always chosen the slow hand of justice considered the immediate need to free a man she loved, and who loved her not as rescue, but as an equal. A plan flashed raw and immediate. Naashá's hands were quick. She had learned to use them that way. Aunt Lona, who had the steady gait of a woman who'd known more winters than anyone else in this troubled valley, started to sing the low call used for gathering goats, an old signal among the women that meant now. Maria slipped from behind a barrel and nudged the guard who was least attentive. A sling of stones knocked a lamp and sent it crashing. In the chaos, a rope slipped around Cole's bound hands. He rolled off the wagon, borrowing motion from an old life and a new purpose. "Run!" he hissed. They moved. It was not a grand movie run, but a series of small, precise actions. Naashá grabbed a handful of the forged papers and fed them into the magistrate's fire, where the flames ate the lies. But Crane's men were fast, and they were cruel. They pulled Ruth from the wagon by her hair. They beat a young man who tried to intervene. A bullet whispered past Naashá's ear. If it had been an inch either side, she might not have known a wound. The air tasted of cordite and fear. They fled into the wash where the trees hid them. But the price was clear. Ruth was gone, and Cole bore a new mark across his shoulder, an ugly slice that would leave a scar. They had lost more than belongings. They had been publicly humiliated. Yet, in that darkest hour, Naashá's resolve did not break. If anything, the blow tempered her. She had been hit where she felt most tender, the lives of her women and the law's willingness to weaponize itself against them. She could have responded with blind rage, letting vengeance fuel her next move. Instead, she let anger refine into a cold plan. They would rescue Ruth and reverse the court's smear. They would gather the women and march, but not as rioters. They would present proof that could not be erased. Cole, breathing hard and bleeding, met her eyes. In that brief exchange, there was no promise of salvation from him, only a vow of work and shared risk. The men who had taken Ruth had miscalculated in thinking terror would silence them. The women of Calico Bend had tasted fear and decided its price was too high. Naashá's darkest hour hardened into a will to fight, not because of hatred, but because she could not allow the law to become the tool of the immoral. She set the plan for the rescue like she would set a broken bone, firm, unflinching, and with patience for healing. They would use every paper, every witness, every small kindness and cunning they had learned. Her brother's name was stained in the ledger of the past, but now, with a fury as precise as a surgeon's hand, she would place the scalpel and cut the rot out. Naashá's plan was simple and brilliant in its practicality. It borrowed elements of old ways, distract the guard with a sound and move like the land, and married them with the modern need for paper and proof. She organized the women into teams: watch, diversion, and subpoena. The men who remained loyal, Cole, and a handful of those who could not be bought, would provide safe extraction routes. They began with distraction. Maria and Aunt Lona took the road into town early, each carrying large bundles of cloth. They staged an argument so heated it drew a small crowd. The sheriff, who loved spectacle, could not help but go to stoke his own importance. While the town's eyes turned, a smaller group moved quietly to the magistrate's hall where Ruth was reportedly held. They had obtained, through bribery of their own and the slight of Cole's former acquaintances, a list of times when the jail was least watched. Naashá and Ruth's sister circled and slipped through the back door that Cole had kept unlocked, with a trick of his fingers and a small brass key. Inside, the magistrate's hall smelled of stale tobacco and official cruelty. Ruth was in a small room, hands bruised but face steady. Naashá opened the door gently, the wooden frame catching like an old hinge. "Ruth," she whispered. The woman looked up and blinked, an awe of disbelief in her features. "We are getting you out." Cole went in front to scout. He moved like a man who had practiced humility as a kind of strength. They slipped Ruth in a shawl and compress, and Naashá placed a clean hand upon her shoulder in the old way of blessing. The magistrate's clerk stumbled in later to find nothing but a faint burst of air and a note that read, "You serve the people, do your duty." It was not an apology. It was a challenge. The rescue's most dangerous moment came at the gate, where a line of Crane's men now expected to find the fugitives. They had anticipated an attempt to storm the jail earlier, and so they had stationed themselves with that delicious certainty of men who thought themselves untouchable. Naashá, who had become adept at reading the shapes of fear and courage in equal measure, forged a new diversion. She had Aunt Lona, who had the voice of a bell, start a song outside the gate, a melody that suggested a burial or an old prayer, one that would pull at the soldiers' memories and make palms slacken. While the men were drawn to the sound like moths, the women moved like ghosts along the fence. A fight erupted when a man named Harlow, furious that their gifts had slipstreamed away, decided to make a lashing example. He drew a pistol. Cole, seeing the barrel's intent, stepped forward, but not with fury. He moved with the measured intention of a man who refused to let violence be the first language. He disarmed Harlow with a swift, clean movement that spoke of his old life, the hand skilled at the necessary violence used to stop cruelty, not to glorify it. That moment, Cole in front and Naashá beside him, changed the tone of their relationship. She did not need rescuing. He did not need to be praised. They were equal partners in a dangerous craft of righting wrongs. Ruth slipped through the gate with the women, safe for the moment, and the band dissolved back into the whirl of traffic. But the rescue did more than free one woman. It ignited the courage of others. As they returned to the safe circle, they found a procession outside the magistrate's office. A group of women from neighboring homesteads, bearing lanterns and the patched quilts of their children. They had come to demand an accounting. They would not be threatened into silence. They would not be lectured into obedience. Naashá led the procession like a quiet storm. The magistrate, who had been comfortable behind his desk, found the hallway full of the faces of those he had thought trivial. In that press of bodies and stories, there was no room for excuses. The women read aloud the names of those whose land had been stolen. They produced the forged papers and the signatures, and the atmosphere shifted like weather. The magistrate's hand trembled as he agreed to send the evidence to a higher court. He could hardly avoid the weight of the public. Crane, caught off guard, tried to downplay the incident, but his private ledger had been slipped into a traveling printer's hands by Cole and a man who had once served him, an act of quiet treachery that would make the ledger public in a neighboring county. The papers circulated like gossip that had become an inconvenient truth. Men who had been bribed suddenly felt the warmth of scrutiny and stepped back, wanting distance from the scandal. In the meantime, Naashá did not rest on any single victory. She organized a network to ensure that legal claims could be enforced, teaching women how to store their paperwork and how to appeal. She insisted that property be registered in the names of women in the families, not just the men, and she fought for a trust that kept the land from being easily sold. She used the hacienda of the mission and the sympathetic judge's office in the neighboring town to register claims and to hold a hearing. The final confrontation with Crane did not come with a cinematic shootout. It came with the sober humiliation of a man stripped of his easy lies. Public accounts showed the ledger's pattern. Men who had benefited from his bribes were called to testify. The cavalry, when presented with evidence that their own money had been tied to illicit payments, found their commanding officer reluctant to proceed with a raid that would, in the public eye, look like collusion. Crane's downfall was not clean. He threatened and intimidated until his threats had no teeth. The court ordered restitution for several families, and though no judge could fully undo the theft of years, the material return of land and the legal acknowledgement of wrongdoing mattered. Ruth's name was cleared. Cole's name was mended in the eyes of some who had once presumed the worst. And Naashá, who had been a woman who had been shuffled by the law and by men, had become a force who shaped law itself. The women celebrated not with drunken revelry, but with a steady turning over of pages, ledgers filling with the names of those who had regained their fields, and charts that told stories of harvests sure to be planted. Naashá stood with Cole beneath the cottonwood, their hands brushing, the future taking on the contours of a work they had both chosen. The aftermath of victory was like the hush after a long winter storm. The air was cleaner, and the sunlight cut through the trees differently. The court had issued a series of rulings that forced Crane to return several parcels of land and to pay restitution. It was not every acre for every family, but it was an acknowledgement engraved on paper and backed by the authority of witnesses who could not be bought. The pride of the town shifted. Men who had once sneered now avoided Naashá's gaze. The cavalry retracted some of its more aggressive patrols, not out of generosity, but because the light had exposed those who had accepted payments. It was pragmatic justice, imperfect yet significant. But the true triumph was not a sheet of paper. It was the transformation in a community. Women who had previously hid their signatures under the hems of their dresses came forward to register land in their names. They opened a cooperative, one that functioned like a garden. Everyone lent labor and received share. Naashá spearheaded a small clinic attached to a trading post where she taught other women how to treat common ailments and how to keep ledgers of their own. The trading post, once a place she had run out of necessity, became a place that bore her name beside a small plaque that read, Begay Clinic and Trading, open to all. The partnership between Cole and Naashá deepened into something that neither resembled the dependency of a damsel nor the ownership of a conquest. Cole had his redemption not handed to him but carved by his choices. He testified in front of a judge, confessing what he had done, and offering a ledger of his own to testify against men who had once employed him to do harm. He did not seek absolution as a prize. He wanted to do the work to make amends. Naashá witnessed this with a quiet approval that did not assign him a role of savior. He had become an ally, chosen and cherished. There were still men who cursed Crane from behind hands, and Harlow found himself judged by a jury that would not look kindly upon paid violence. For every petty tyrant, there were now women who would not be easily pushed aside. The Women's Cooperative enabled a small credit fund that allowed them to buy tools and store seed, a financial independence that meant they could no longer be bought by a coin or a favor. Naashá's transformation was visible in small, concrete ways. Her hair, once tied back in haste, rested in a simpler, confident braid. She wore a leather apron when planting now, and her boots were scuffed with the paint of living. She no longer kept to the shadows. Her voice carried in the town square, not as an echo but as an authority. People came with illnesses and legal problems. She treated both with a steady hand. The most daring demonstration of her agency came when a land buyer from the railroad company came to offer her a wad of coin for a parcel she had rightfully fixed. He offered a price that could easily have solved a great many problems. She looked at the man, then at Cole, and then at the ledger of women gathered around them. "No," she said simply. "My land is not for sale." Cole stood with his hand casually hooked in the crook of his arm, not speaking for her, but affirming his support in a way that held the correct balance of respect. In their shared life, decisions were debated, but ultimately hers to make when it concerned her vision. He learned to live with the parameters she set and admired them. She learned to accept his counsel when she asked for it. Their love was not the plot's center. It was a natural bloom from the ways they chose each day to stand together. Their love was a partnership of equals. They argued, sometimes loudly, over the proper way to keep the ledger and whether to accept a traveling doctor into the cooperative. They made mistakes and apologized. They kept each other's trust like a fragile steam engine. Maintained well, it would carry them far. Women congregated at the clinic and around the trading post to share stories. Aunt Lona taught children to weave and to read the small letters inside the margins of law. The women banded together to establish a small school where Ruth taught reading and arithmetic in the afternoons. They reconstructed a network of mutual support that made them stronger than the sum of their parts. When the seasons turned and the harvest came, they celebrated in a way that was not gaudy, but deeply satisfying. Naashá stood on her small porch and watched as the women brought in baskets of grain and the men tended fences. Cole carried a basket of eggs and set it down at her feet, an old gesture now braided with new meaning. They were partners, equals, and lovers who had chosen one another because of, rather than despite, their flaws and histories. In the end, the triumph of justice was less about prisons and more about the restoration of dignity. Men like Crane were forced out of positions where they could devour the weak. The cavalry found itself monitored by a newly formed council that included elders and women, and the system shifted in small but durable ways. Naashá had not only reclaimed land, she had rebuilt the social stitches that held a community together. She had become the hero of her own story, not a heroine in a tale written by a man with a pen. Years later, the trading post stood with a tidy signboard nailed with deliberate pride, Begay Clinic and Trading Co. The words were not ostentatious. They stated simple fact. Naashá, now 44, moved through her days with a composed energy. Her hands bore the faint puck of work and age, lines that spoke of years of sewing, of binding, of pouring tea for the anxious and the joyful alike. Her eyes still held the same stubborn light, but now there was a softness worked into them by the healing of time. The property was registered in her name and in the name of a small cooperative trust she had helped found. The house beside the clinic, modest and well-kept, belonged jointly to Naashá and Cole. They had married not because anyone demanded it, but because they chose a public vow to one another in front of their community. They were neighbors to their co-op. They were hosts to a small porch where children learned to carve simple toys and elders told stories about how the world had been shaped. Financial independence grew like a carefully tended crop. The Women's Cooperative had a ledger that no one could buy. They lent seed and tools, and when the railroad came, later than all the men had once feared, they negotiated fair access to trade routes. The community built a small schoolhouse and a communal granary. The ledger of their lives was a different kind of book now. Not one of debts, but of credits recorded by people who were empowered to write their own names. Naashá's attire reflected the journey. Gone were the frayed shawls of her early days. She favored practical satins of color that spoke of a woman who had the luxury of choices. Dresses embroidered by the women of the cooperative, an apron for the garden work, boots that had known 3 winters. She still wore a strip of her husband's scarf now and then, knotted at the throat like a relic of memory turned into comfort. Her hair, braided with a thin leather tie, moved like a banner when she walked. Cole had become the kind of man who could fix a fence and hold a baby without looking out of place. He helped run the trading post's small ledger and took on security duties only when necessary. He had the scar on his shoulder, and Naashá, who had no desire to erase evidence of a lived life, would sometimes trace it like a map of places they had been. He was not the center of her life, he was the one who matched her stride. Women from other towns came to learn from their cooperative. Naashá taught classes on preserving food, basic herbal remedies, and how to document property rights. The knowledge shared became a currency of empowerment. They established an annual fair where women sold their wares and read law aloud. Justice, she taught them, was not a moment but a practice. Keep your papers, know your rights, and do not be afraid to speak. Female solidarity had become a woven thing. Aunt Lona ran a small library where one could find medical pamphlets and heavy law books. Ruth taught reading to a classroom of eager children, and Maria oversaw the herd, which now belonged collectively to several families. The small town's culture shifted. People who had once been invisible now took up space at the council table. Cole's redemption arc wound like a quiet road. He did not seek statutes of forgiveness, but found his own mending in honest labor. He volunteered in the evenings, teaching boys how to fix a plow and men how to keep their hands from the kind of greed that had once steamrolled over human lives. He and Naashá argued about small things, a missed payment, the placement of a window, but always returned to compromise. He loved her not as a thing to be won, but as an equal whose boundaries he respected and whose voice he deferred to on matters that mattered to her. On a late autumn afternoon, after the harvest and the last of the repairs, Naashá walked the border of the co-op with her hands in the pockets of a warm jacket. The land underfoot was plowed and patient, seed had been planted, and the rows held the promise of next year's bread. Children ran with string kites, and the bell at the schoolhouse rang, a sound that filled her with a humble joy. She thought of the ledger that had once been used to take. The memory of her brother lingered in the margins of her life, but she felt less strangled by the absence. They had placed a small stone on a hill with his name chiseled into it, a quiet marker that said, "We remembered." The truth of him was stitched into the community that had refused to let him be erased. Naashá's legacy was not built on singular epic triumphs, but on the daily practice of care, law, and commerce. She had become a woman who could both scold a man for reckless spending and deliver the medicine that would soothe his fever. She had become the leader that a tribe and a town could rely upon. She had not been shaped by a man, but had chosen a partner who matched her grit with his own. Her new beginning was not an end so much as a living continuation. The clinic took in patients, and the cooperative thrummed with trade. Women taught women and did not leave each other to sink. The land was registered in names that would not be easily erased. She had achieved what she had set out to do: protect her people, secure the land, and create a life she had chosen. Cole and Naashá stood on the porch of their shared home as the sun set like a coin over the range. He took her hand, not to claim it, but to cherish it. "We have work yet," he said, nodding to the fields. "We always will," she replied, smiling in a way that had no apology. "Good thing we have allies." The years ahead promised more fights, more small victories, and more laughter. The town of Calico Bend had been remade not by one man's gun, but by a community of women and their allies who refused to be erased. Naashá had transformed from a vulnerable woman shoved aside by systematic injustice into a leader who shaped the fate of others. She had saved herself, and in doing so, created a place where other women could save themselves too. And so her story ends where yours continues. And so her story ends where yours continues. She was told she was broken, but she proved them wrong. She was left for dead, but she rose stronger. She was meant to be silent, but she roared. In ceremonies you will not find in books and in stubborn ledger entries in plain ink. If you're a woman who's been knocked down but refused to stay down, if you know the weight of loss and the slow, stubborn work of rebuilding, if you believe it's never too late to reclaim your power, then you've found your people. Subscribe to witness more legends of women who refused to be victims, who turned pain into power, who wrote their own endings on plots of land and pages of law. Like this story, if you believe every woman deserves a second chance at happiness on her own terms. Share it with every woman who needs to remember her own strength. Hit that bell, sister. Because these stories aren't just entertainment. They are reminders that you are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and deserving of a love that sees you as the hero you truly are.